Hare Krishna. Welcome back to our study of the Yoga Sutras. In this session, we are going to discuss two sutras, sutras number 3 and 4, where Patanjali is going to describe a very important philosophical concept. If you remember, in sutra number 2, we saw the definition of yoga, yoga chitta vritti nirodha. And in that sutra, we saw the importance of restraining these modifications of consciousness, which we learned the term chitta vrittis. Now, somebody reading that sutra will have a doubt. So what happens if I actually restrain the modifications of the chitta? Or in simple understanding, what happens if I restrain my thoughts? If I become thoughtless, will I cease to exist? Or does it mean that I become totally unconscious? Right? That could be a question that may come up. Like, what is the ultimate stage of perfection? Is it a state of nothingness where I lose my existence? Or is it some state of existence where I'm like a vegetable, right? Where I'm just completely unconscious of what is happening around me, right? What exactly is that perfected stage when the chitta vrittis are indeed controlled? So that is going to be highlighted in sutra number 3. What happens when the chitta vrittis are indeed restrained, right? And then, keeping in line with the sutra tradition, which is a logical flow of thought, Patanjali in the next sutra also explains what happens if the chitta vrittis are not restrained, right? So this very stark contrast of what happens when the mind is controlled and what happens when the mind is uncontrolled is very beautifully highlighted in sutras 3 and 4. So let us begin with sutra number 3. He says, Tada drashtuhu swarupe avasthanam. Right? Let's recite the sutra. Tada drashtu swarupe avasthanam. What does it say? Tada. Tada means then. When? Then, having controlled the chitta vrittis, in sutra number 2, he said, Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. After having controlled the mind, the chitta vrittis, then drashtuhu, the seer. Now, what is a seer? I thought, the mind is seeing, right? So this is a very important point that Patanjali is going to explain in this sutra. The seer, in short, here is the experiencer, the soul, the purusha. If you remember, in the previous session, we understood Chitta is just the interface between the Purusha and Prakriti, the soul and matter. So in this case, the seer then becomes the Purusha or the soul who's experiencing, who's witnessing these worldly interactions. So then, tada drashtuhu swarupe avasthanam. Then one becomes situated in one's own swarupa. Rupa means form. Rupa also means nature. Swarupa here means one's true nature. So the translation becomes, then the seer, the Purusha, the soul in short, then the seer abides in one's own true nature. This is what happens when the chitta vrittis are regulated. One becomes situated in one's own true identity, in one's own true nature as the Purusha, as that spirit soul. This is what happens if we just learn to control the mind. We will experience a state of realizing our true identity. So to understand this concept better, I'm going to give you a very powerful example. Think of the seer here, the soul, to be in some kind of a handicapped state, right? In a kind of a conditioned state. So as you can see here, imagine a person who from their childhood was born with a cone around their neck. Now, Because of that cone, the person was never able to see their own body, because the cone restricted the movement of their neck. The cone restricted their vision, that they could not actually see their full form, right? Now, in such a state of conditioning, or in such kind of a limited state, that person needs an external means to look at oneself. In this case, the person would need a mirror, right? In this case, we understand that the mirror is the chitta, the means that the Purusha uses to look at reality. So this conditioned soul, or this handicapped person here, whose vision is limited, when they're looking at the mirror of chitta, that is how they can perceive reality. Now, this chitta is not an ordinary mirror. It is like one of those fun house mirrors, the circus mirrors, which sometimes creates a perception that you look very long and tall. And as soon as the mirror stretches that image, you look at yourself and say, oh, look, I'm so tall and big and strong, and you become very happy by looking at this reflection. But then sometimes that mirror, it shrinks, it distorts, and because of the distortion, what earlier you were looking nice and tall and big and strong, now suddenly you become very short and fat and funny, and you become very sad, right? And literally every time that mirror fluctuates, or the chitta fluctuates, right, we experience states of happiness and sadness, and this fluctuation is what we called as chitta vrittis. And literally what we experience in our day-to-day life, or the so-called perceptions of worldly happiness and sorrow, are nothing but just these reflections that we are seeing in the fluctuating mirror of the mind. So if I really want to see myself, if I want to get a real picture of reality, what should I do? I should stop this mirror from fluctuating, right? Sometimes you would have noticed, if you stand near a pond or a lake, you can see your reflection, but every time there are ripples and waves in that lake, your perception, your reflection gets distorted. So this is exactly what we go through in the chitta. These chitta vrittis, or modifications of the chitta, are creating a distortion of reality, are creating a distortion in our perception of the world outside and also ourselves. Consequently, we get tossed around in these waves of happiness and sorrow, fame and infamy, loss and gain. We go through these whole cycles of dualities of worldly experiences, right? But if I can only learn to make the mirror steady, then what will happen? Tada drashtuhu swarupe avasthanam. Then the seer abides in one's own true form, or one's own true nature. Then I can see my real reflection, right? And this is what we are trying to achieve through our yoga practice. When the chitta becomes stable, steady, calm, free from all distortions or vrittis, that is when I can see my real self. In a sense, that is the first goal, so to speak, that Patanjali is offering right at the beginning of the book, right? And Sutra number 4 explains, then what happens if I do not control my mind? So one thing is clear. If I do control my chitta, or the mind, then I am able to get a proper vision of reality. Not only the world outside, but I can also see myself properly. That is fine. So which means that I will no more, chitta vritti nirodha does not mean that I become unconscious or I become like a vegetable or I will cease to exist. I will still continue to exist, but I will exist in a more natural and a true state without any distortion. But what happens if the mind is not controlled? That he explains in the next sutra, saying vritti sarupyam itaratra. Right? Let's recite it. Vritti sarupyam itaratra. Vrittis, these modifications, these chitta vrittis, sarupyam or swarupa, very similar word, identification, itaratra, at other times. So what does other times here mean? When the chitta vrittis are not controlled, right? In the previous sutra, we saw that when you are not situated in your swarupa, in your real identity, then what happens? At other times, itaratra, vritti sarupyam, you end up identifying with those modifications. You end up identifying with those chitta vrittis. Otherwise, there is identification with the vrittis or these modifications in our internal states. And this is what our daily life is. Or in scriptural language, this is what conditional living means. It means we become, our awareness or our own self-identity becomes superimposed by these external worldly fluctuations. We go through so many emotions and we end up identifying with all of them, right? Sometimes you may feel mad or bad or sad, and you end up thinking, oh, I am a mad person, I am a sad person, I am a bad person. But this sutra actually gives every practitioner some hope that, look, I am different from the states of my mind. I am different from what I'm feeling. I am different from what I'm thinking. I am even different from the kind of desires that I'm having. Because the real self, the soul, the Purusha, is so much more different and beautiful and pure than these imperfections and these distortions that I'm experiencing at the level of the chitta. And I don't have to limit myself to these conditionings, to these fluctuations or limitations that my chitta is imposing upon me. And this is what Patanjali is offering right at the beginning. When he defines yoga chitta vritti nirodha, this is what we can experience. We can experience a true state of the soul as that Sat, Chit and Ananda, eternal, fully cognizant and so full of bliss. That state can be experienced if only we can learn to control the modifications of the chitta. And therefore, this is what we learned in these two sutras, in sutras number 3 and 4, that it is not that when the mind is controlled or when the chitta vrittis are controlled, in that thoughtless state, it is not that the soul ceases to exist or it becomes unconscious. That state is a very powerful and dynamic state, which Patanjali is going to describe later on in that book. Right? And 2, we also understood that how to see reality as it is, we have to learn to clear the chitta. Right now, the chitta is superimposing its own distortions upon us. It is described later on that at that state, the chitta becomes like a transparent crystal. What comes in is what that comes out without any kind of form of distortion. And that is a state we want to achieve. And there's a very hope-giving point for all of us that our real self is beyond all these distortions that we experience at a mental, physical, emotional, intellectual levels. The real self is so much more purer and beautiful beyond all of this. And with this hope, Patanjali is going to take us into the future sutras, where in the next sutra, he is going to specifically talk about what exactly are these vrittis. All right. So stay tuned for more of these sessions, and thank you all for joining us today. Hare Krishna.